This is a segment I'm going to be doing where I'm going to be looking at Donald Trump's recent actions and his recent policies and contrasting them with the promises and implied promises that were made both in his 2016 election campaign and the 2024 election campaign. And I will be critical. I'm wondering how it's playing off against his base, but we are in England, we're on the ground in England, we can only get a very limited view of how people are thinking about things in America because we only have access to a limited slice of public opinion, what we see on the internet. So as I go through all of this, please let us know how you're feeling about it, and also I am going to be critical during this, so please forgive me for that. Don't hold it against me. I'm not your enemy. I simply want what is best for the West and the US in general, and I think that what's been going on, particularly with the aggressive actions towards Iran recently, is not what's going to be best for the West. If the US does decide to engage in a ground war with Iran on the side of Israel, I do believe that given that Iran is a regional hegemon in that territory in the Middle East, that like what happened with Iraq and Afghanistan, it will probably lead, instead of a very swift and smooth regime change, to civil war in the area, especially with the 15 million or so, I think it was 15 million or so, Afghans who entered into Iran after the fall of the Western-backed government that was in Afghanistan at the time, all of whom are going to occupy, who are going to be a fifth column within the territory. Iran itself is a very ethnically mixed population, 50 or so percent Persians, but that data is quite old now, so I don't know exactly the ethnic makeup, but it's very diverse, and this always leads to civil war. And we're back. Thank you very much for sticking around, everybody. I can only assume that Sadiq Khan's office decided to shut us down temporarily under false accusations of identity theft. Either way, as I was saying, just to preface everything I'm going to go through, if there is ground war in Iran, I do not think that it will lead to World War III. World War III will not happen because Russia and China are not going to actually engage with the US in any great capacity. I think the worst case scenario, which is the most likely scenario if that happens, is civil war that leads to migration flows. Either way, so starting off with deportations, we know one of the big things that people voted for Trump for was to stem the flow of illegal migration into the country, which, as far as I know, given border crossings have drastically reduced, has been relatively successful. But one of the things that he also promised was huge numbers of deportations, as supported by Stephen Miller and other people within his administration. The recent news is that on Truth Social, he called to federal agencies to do all in their power to deliver the single largest mass deportation program in history, and he named LA, where the riots have been going on recently, Chicago and New York as specific targets. So that's words, but what other actions have been taken? Well, the really disappointing news, as reported on by all people of National Review, is that the DHS recently decided that it would not conduct worksite investigations or operations on the agriculture, restaurant, and hotel industries. The new policy is a form of administrative amnesty for illegal workers in those industries. As with any amnesty, the recipients are allowed to remain in the US for now, but their status comes not from Congress changing the law, but from the administration declaring that they won't enforce the law against them. According to this report here, the current estimates are that this covers about 12.5% of illegal immigrants. But one of the problems that it also brings is the new incentives, which is that if you are an illegal immigrant in the US, you want to stay, you might move into those industries so that you can be a recipient of the administrative amnesty. And if you are someone trying to cross the border at the moment, then you will go straight into those industries so that you can avoid being deported straight away. So as far as I'm concerned, that's very, very disappointing. That is quite a step back from the initial promises that were made, all for the sake of, I assume, protecting cheap labor in those industries, when really the job should be going to Americans.
All aliens are illegal, but some are more illegal than others.
Exactly. Then there is...
Have you got the numbers on this? Because when we were looking at, like, the fact he's looking about 2 million.
Yes, 2 million amnesty recipients, and that's according to the estimates from the Centre for Immigration Studies of 15.8 million illegal immigrants. And I don't know how accurate those estimates are.
Pretty reasonable. I've been following this and looking at the numbers since to see that how the border has been controlled, and so to slow this down. And been watching the arguments about that, and you're quite right to pick up the fact that there has been a real big lobbying process by industry to try and stop these people from being deported. And what seems to be happening is, and I don't know if you're going to cover this as well, is that the contraction of those that they're also going to remove is down now to criminality. So serious criminals, money laundering issues, drug enforcement cases, which takes that number even further down from the 15.8 million. And there's a lot of anger out there. I mean, that I've seen and been watching at this, that there is a feeling that he's being taken over by their equivalent of the blob. They call it the deep state. That they're allowing this for economic reasons.
Well, as we go along here, I believe there is plenty of reason to believe that the Trump administration has been co-opted by the neoconservatives, the deep state, whatever you want to term them, that he is not keeping his promises, although, of course, if you actually listen back to the sorts of things that he was saying in both of his campaigns, his promises could occasionally be very vague, whereas some of the more clear statements that he made, especially regarding immigration, were things like that he wanted DACA recipients to be able to remain in the US. He still wanted people to be able to come in huge numbers, never before seen numbers of immigrants into the country, but as long as they were doing it legally. He still wanted to make sure that there were lots of students, especially from China, coming into the country. So there is a lot that you could say about whether he made very definitive promises or not. Either way, very disappointing for what people were initially voting for him for. The other thing that I wanted to mention before we get to the Iran situation is the Epstein files, which was a huge thing right at the beginning of his administration this year, but then got dropped very quickly after February, when there were more than 100 pages of declassified documents related to Epstein released, most of which we already had in unredacted form. These versions were heavily redacted, and then Pam Bondi, who released them, made a big fuss about the fact that possibly parts of the FBI were withholding them. We heard very, very little about it ever since then, except for when Elon Musk had a big falling out with Donald Trump a few weeks ago, him out of the blue saying that the reason that the files hadn't come out was because of the fact that Donald Trump's name was in them. And that was a tweet that he has subsequently deleted, and I believe he's also apologized for it, saying that he was going a little bit crazy. There's been some attempts to reconnect the two since then. So that's the last we've really heard about the Epstein files, and I don't see that changing. I was looking into more recent reports on what's going on with them, and the most that I could find was people speaking about Elon Musk's accusation. And now let's go into the Iran situation. And I wanted to try and be a bit more comprehensive with what's been going on with Iran. And I've been listening to quite a bit of coverage. I listened to, let me double check his name, Brian Boletic on the Duran recently. I listened to a bit of what AA has spoken about. I've been looking into a lot of what the mainstream media has been saying about. So I'm going to try to go through the events as I understand them, going back to looking at what was going on right last year. For some reason, this article isn't available on this browser, so I'll just read the notes that I've got here. So this article was from November of last year, which was the time when Iran and Israel were flying off a initial volley of missiles at one another, and it seemed like Iran was testing the defensive capabilities of the Iron Dome if it came to a greater conflict later on. So Trump triggered initially, it says here, a standoff with Iran after he abandoned the 2015 accords, which were known as the JCPOA, that Tehran had signed with world powers, and imposed waves of sanctions on the Islamic Republic and what he called a maximum pressure campaign. After this, he accused Tehran of violating the spirit of the agreement by funneling newfound revenue to support its regional proxies, notably the Lebanese group Hezbollah, which we're all familiar with by now. In retaliation, Iran significantly expanded its nuclear activities and is enriching uranium near to weapons grade, despite insisting that its program was for civilian purposes. We know now, after an IAEA report from earlier this year, I believe they had stockpiles of 60% enriched uranium, and that was enough to manufacture, if they wanted to, 9 nuclear warheads. But at the same time, in March, Tulsi Gabbard had done an intelligence report looking into the situation, where she had advised Donald Trump that she did not believe that the Iranian regime was building nuclear weapons. And despite all of this, at the time last year, Iran was saying that they wanted to maintain relations with America and Donald Trump in particular to try and negotiate something in the future when it came time for his administration. He'd also accused earlier this year, in March, he'd said that Iran would face dire consequences unless Houthi attacks stopped, because of the Houthis, of course, being backed by Iran. He said that every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon from this point forward as being shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran. Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences, and those consequences will be dire. This was before negotiations had started, so you could attribute a lot of this to typical Trump tough talk in the lead up to negotiations. He also said back in April that the US was going to be having direct talks with Iran, and this is when you start to see this phrase start to pop up quite a lot, saying that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, which is a phrase that he started to repeat a lot in reference to people.
And that's when we start to see a big change in terms of the American mentality towards Iran, and where I feel that they've been taken over by the warmongers, the same sort of people that want to have continual war in Ukraine, which is an issue that I know you're not touching today, but it actually has become less and less tough on Ukraine, and more tough on the idea that we have this continual war. But what's interesting to me, we had the conversation this week on Radio 4. I just happened to catch it in the morning, not by chance of wanting to listen to it all the time, but I was in the car, and the former head of MI6 was making a statement that in regards of intelligence from the UK, they did not feel that Iran had the capability to be able to produce nuclear weapons at this stage. So we tend to, along with the French, have allegedly better kind of connections into Iran when it comes to this kind of assessment, and the US, through its Five Eyes, are supposed to listen to us. So either they're listening totally to the Israelis now and saying who are saying outwardly they've got it capable, as you say, to do 9, or they don't have it and they're using it as an excuse, as a plan to kind of do regime change in Iraq, because they've been successful across the Middle East everywhere else.
Yeah, well, regime change we saw earlier this year in Syria with the fall of the Assad regime. The US has been involved in regime change in Afghanistan. Very unsuccessful in the long run, but they were involved in the first place, and in Iraq. So this is just typical American foreign policy. And for those who were hoping that and voted for Donald Trump in the hopes that he would signal a change of US foreign policy, where they weren't going to play world police anymore, where America first was going to signal some kind of foreign policy that didn't want to get people dragged into wars in the Middle East. Foreign policy seems to have carried on just the same as it always did. The Pentagon and the deep state seem to be getting what they want, and I'll show more evidence for that as we go forward.
It reminds me a lot, actually, of just over 100 years ago, when you look at US history, with Warren Harding and his campaign. It was all, platformed on a return to normalcy, a return to, after the America's obviously engagement in World War One.
Yes.
And, wars in the continent, distant wars far afield that don't really concern us, and all of the massive social change that was going on at the time. And so there's actually a similarity between Harding's platform back then and Trump's platform most recently.
Shockingly enough, there's also a similarity between Trump's platform that he was campaigning on and also FDR's platform that he was campaigning on in 1940, when he was explicit in his speeches that he was going to keep the US out of any European war and make sure that American soldiers were not going off to die for some foreign cause like happened in the First World War. But we know actually now from a lot of diaries, a lot of declassified documents and other things that FDR was explicitly trying to maneuver the US into the war, trying to find any way to get US soldiers into Europe. Not saying that...
As was the case in World War I as well.
As was the case in World War I. Not saying that Donald Trump is...
Well, they make money out of it. I mean, and I know this is an uncomfortable thing for our American audience, but in every war that's occurred since the First World War, America's made money on it. And they're going to make money, for example, on Ukraine, huge amounts in terms of the deal that was done by Trump. After the Second World War, the reparations wasn't just how much we had to pay and Europe had to pay back. We had to give up land. We had to give up assets to the United States. So they benefited from that. And our empire declined with the growing influence. And I think to an element of this is also about reconstructing the Middle East for the long-term benefit economically of some of the bigger corporate interests, which are often behind the warmongers. You know, we look at that and they turn around. Someone used to say we want to get a McDonald's into every country, but in reality, they want to get everything that's into every country.
Yes,
you know.
totally.
Yes, it's all part of the liberal world order. So following this, we start to get the negotiations going on, and Iran was already starting to get a little bit antsy about this, where the Ayatollah was saying that Trump was lying about bringing peace to the Middle East. These comments came after Donald Trump went on a 4-day tour of the Gulf allies, Saudis, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and followed by quickly a start of a new Israeli military campaign in the Gaza Strip. He said the recent remarks of the US president during his visit to the region are a disgrace to the speaker and a disgrace to the American nation. Trump said he wanted to use the power for peace. He lied. And then Khamenei said the exact sort of thing that you would expect him to say about Israel, Zionist regime, malignant cancerous tumor, little Satan, etc., etc. And it says here that while Iran's rhetoric against the US and its allies persists, Tehran and Washington were negotiating a new deal to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons and to avoid large-scale conflict in the Middle East. Ali Shamkhani, a top advisor to Khamenei, told NBC that week that Iran would commit to never making nuclear weapons, eliminating stockpiles of highly enriched uranium, enriching uranium only to lower levels needed for civilian use, and allowing international inspectors to supervise it in exchange for the lifting of all sanctions on Iran. However, Trump said he wanted to avoid a deal with Iran that resembled the JCPOA, the one that Obama brokered, which was reached during Obama, and Trump withdrew from. So he wanted to prevent going down that same route again. And I thought I'd take a look as to what, at the time, polls were showing regarding American support for talks with Iran. And bipartisan support was showing at least 69% for talks with Iran over aggressive conduct, and 64% of Republicans were also in support of that. So again, I'm interested to see how opinions have changed, or if they stayed the same, if more people are in favor of on-the-ground action with them now.
It's fascinating. 64% of Republicans were there saying that they want to continue with negotiations with Iran. And because most people see common sense. Look, we're not big fans of Iran. You know, are we anyone really shooting out and say, yo, Khamenei? None of us are actually doing that.
You don't have to be in favor of or like a country's state or their state culture to want to avoid going to war with them.
That's right, exactly that. And I think really most of us are looking at this and saying, dragging us into wars, whether it's against Iran, whether it's against China, whether it's against Russia, is not in the long-term interest of people. When we're spending so much, our debts are too high, immigration is moving around, and all the points that you're raising at the moment are incredibly valid of why I think 64% of Republicans there were saying we don't want it.
Yes, and the frustrating thing for me that I've encountered speaking about this on Twitter, and I know that the Twitter is not representative of people, but I have encountered a number of these warhawk, fear-mongering types who are saying that we need to because they've got nukes and they've got all of this threat and they're going to target the West immediately after they take care of Israel, etc., etc., is that they, like so many, are pushing for wars that they will not fight.
Absolutely.
They do not expect that if war occurs, us that they will be boots on the ground, putting themselves in the line of fire for the sake of freedom in the Middle East, or freedom wherever you want to say. They are expecting other people's children to go and fight and die for them. Similarly, there's an attitude that I've seen crop up in the UK over the past day or so as well, which is that Iran deserves it because it's an Islamist nation, and that somehow by proxy, initiating and involving ourselves in a war with Iran will somehow fix the problem of the grooming gangs. And I think that is an absurd kind of tribalism that has no logical argument in its own favour. And I would ask you this: when we were involved in war and regime change in Afghanistan, after that project was over, did we have more or less Afghanis in England?
More. And we still got it.
Of course we had more.
And more Iraqis.
And more Iraqis. The scheme was taken advantage of by any opportunities. And I know the play. I've seen it before. I've seen it too many times in my 28 years to not understand where this will go, which will be that Iranians are the most evil, despicable, repressive people on earth. We need to punish them for their crimes against humanity, until all of a sudden they're starting to move west as part of a refugee crisis, at which point you're racist bigots if you don't want to take them into your own country.
Well, if you didn't want them, maybe you shouldn't have bombed them.
Yeah.
It's that argument as always. But anyway, so the next thing that I had was that as part of the negotiations, tensions were continually rising between Iran and Israel at the time, and Israel was seeming to start to gesture towards having an attack on Iran. But Trump had said explicitly not to do that. End the Gaza war, stop the Iranian threats. We are trying to negotiate at the moment. You are not helping tensions by doing this. And this was back in, this was the day before. This was the day before the attacks first started. So that is a final statement saying, do not do it. And then the next day they did. So let's take a look at some of the more context here, which is featured in this BBC article, which gives a bit more of the details. So as I mentioned, the IAEA had said in its latest quarterly report, because again, just to add all the context for this, the basis for this attack is being rested on the idea that Iran has nuclear weapons or nuclear capabilities, that they are just around the corner from developing nuclear weapons, that needs to be stopped, because if they develop these nuclear weapons, they will not only be an existential threat to Israel and other and other countries in the Middle East, but to the West in general. They are an insane, theocratic regime that can't have nuclear weapons under any cost. That's what Donald Trump has said. Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. Even though, again, Tulsi Gabbard, as part of the intelligence community, has said that from her own reports that they are not developing nuclear weapons. Either way, the IAEA said in its latest quarterly report that Iran had amassed enough uranium enriched to 60% purity to potentially make 9 nuclear bombs. Potentially, not that they were or were going to, but potentially. In the first few days following the attack by Israel, 3 key facilities in Iran's vast program have been targeted: Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow. The IAEA has said that a pilot fuel enrichment plant above ground at Natanz was destroyed. The IAEA also reported that 4 critical buildings were damaged at Isfahan. Israel describes the damage to Iran's facilities as significant. Iran is saying that it's limited. Of course, we've got all the fog of war, so we can't really know for certain right now. Israel's also striking sources of knowledge by assassinating at least 9 nuclear scientists so far, and a growing list of top military commanders. From listening to AA's coverage of this, what he was saying about this, and his father's Iranian, so he got the information off of his dad, is apparently it's the IRGC, isn't it? Apparently, the way that organization works is that the members of it never actually retire. So if military commanders get killed off in the line of duty or assassinated, as we see here, what happens is just that the people who were slightly older than them who had retired or gone out of active duty just fill in their places again. So it's a very interesting way that means they maintain their reserves. Its list of targets, which includes military bases, missile launch pads, and factories, is now widening to economic and oil facilities. Iran's also hitting back with its own expanding hit list as civilian casualties mount in both countries. To deal a decisive blow to Iran's vast nuclear program, Israel would have to do significant damage to Fordo, its second largest and most heavily protected site. The complex is deep underground in a mountain, and it's where some experts believe that Iran has stockpiled much of its nuclear weapons-grade uranium. Reports in Israeli media say the current aim is to try to cut off access to the facility, and Israel doesn't have bunker-busting bombs. It needs to smash through all of the rock that's on top of the site.
When you kind of say this litany of all the things that are happening in terms of the information that the IEA is producing, when you talk about the assassinations that occurred of scientists and individuals, when we talk about expanding the ground war, does this not remind you of exactly the same sort of play out that we were doing in Iraq with weapons of mass destruction which weren't there?
It certainly
we know
does.
They weren't there, so why isn't the public in our country getting really angry that we're being fed more lies again when we've got people suggesting quite clearly from Tulsi Gabbard and others, as there were calls at weapons of mass destruction, that this is just created and being created to give us the platform to be able to invade or get a bigger war coming through.
Because it's very, very apparent, isn't it, that it doesn't really matter how much the public in America or Britain or any nation in the West really consents to things happening. If the powers that be want them to happen, then they will happen.
Well, to try to explain why it is that Iran may have that much stockpiled uranium, it is possible that they might in the future want to consider developing nuclear weapons for its own defensive purposes. I do not believe that they would be a belligerent, given that they only have limited capabilities as it is, and if they did, they would get nuked off of the map straight away.
Of course, they'd be gone in
instead, I do think it's important to note that Israel, since establishing itself in the region, has been increasingly belligerent, increasingly territorial, expanding its territory, engaging in wars, all backed by the number one superpower, and it has made it explicit that it wants regime change in Iran, as does the US, because they want to return to maybe the old Shah, an exiled elite that would be more friendly to US interests, be more amenable when negotiating contracts and deals for things like oil.
Yeah, so, and importantly, a gap between Russia and China.
Yes, and the gap between Russia and China.
This is the long-term aim, and I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen the kind of speeches and stand-up comedy in a way. I should say from the old Shah's family. You know, how many of them they want to put a new king back in, a new Shah back into Iran. So this isn't even about giving them democracy. It's about removing a theocracy and putting in their own king who would be amenable to us. And wasn't that exactly what caused the problem in the first place? We, the Brits, put in somebody. So rather than giving it to the hands of the people anyway, they're still going to be told who they're going to have running or controlling them.
They've had, in the past 100 or so years, a number of regime changes backed variously by foreign powers that have made it so that for a long while it was essentially a puppet state. And the 1979 revolution aimed to change that when the Ayatollah decided to maintain power and the mullahs maintained power as well. And you can think what you want about how they treat their own citizens, how the regime behaves. But the fact of the matter is, since then, we have made it very clear that we are seeking regime change. And so,
but we do have a difficult challenge, don't we? And
of course.
And that difficult challenge is that we can't allow Israel to continually feel as though it's being threatened, and there needs to be some form of mechanism in place to get these people who particularly the leadership, I wouldn't say necessarily the people, who absolutely abhor each other. The Iranians at the top really don't like the Israelis. The Israelis at the top really don't like the Iranians. And America will come and always back Israel at any cost, as you quite rightly said. So how do we create a scenario where Israel doesn't want to lose its crap and go out and bomb the hell out of Iran as it's doing now, and the Iranians to carry on doing what they want to do, which is run a nuclear program.
I think it would require somebody like a forceful personality like Donald Trump to apply the pressure that America can and say, we need to resolve this peacefully. Because America does have the power to do that. They are still the number one global superpower. Obviously, there are threats to that coming up, but America doesn't in these situations. It's been remarked many times that it seems there's no red line that Israel can cross that America won't support them on. And if that's the American choice in dealing with foreign policy in the Middle East, that's their choice. But if you were to look to resolve this without conflict, then America would need to say, here are the terms. Donald Trump said explicitly, do not attack Iran. The day after, they do. And it was, frankly, they were in the middle of negotiations with Donald Trump at the time. It was an unprovoked attack. They initiated hostilities in this. Obviously, you can say a lot about Iran funding Hezbollah and other things, but in terms of this conflict right now, that's the case. And Donald Trump initially wanted to distance himself with it, but since then has gone all-out belligerent. So, posting this yesterday on Truth Social, saying unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender is Winston Churchill all over again. And saying that, which is like, sorry, the US hasn't declared war on Iran, has it? Has it? I know that Israel needs the bunker bombs to be able to get to Fordow, but they don't actually have those, but the US has them. So obviously, given that Israel can only put up a limited front for a short amount of time, they need America to begin giving them those bunker bombs or outright dragging themselves into the war anyway. So what's it going to be? This was in regards to the Tulsi Gabbard thing, and it does seem that there is some suggestions that talks might go back into ceasefire and peace deals, nuclear deals, but we will see how that goes. So I thought I'd take a look at some of the reactions that we've had from some of the pro and anti-war types who made up the MAGA coalition up until now. So Joel Berry from the Babylon Bee was saying, one good thing to do if you're anti-war is to prevent a desert tribe of bloodthirsty religious cultists from obtaining nukes, which is the same line that we've heard for years at this point, which is just this one last war. Just this one last war. You don't like war. I don't like war either. I hate war. But if we fight this one last war, no more wars. There's bullshit and you know it.
We've said since 1914.
That's BS. I'm sorry. Nobody's buying that anymore. You have I only just learned who this man is, right? Mark Levin. And I've discovered that he is an utter madman, posting this, we in real MAGA, real American patriots, stand with you, Mr. President, our military and our Israeli allies. Whatever's happening, we should strongly support our president and our troops, pray for them, blah, blah. He posted this.
We're fake MAGA grifters if we're concerned.
Well, no. This is the real MAGA foreign policy, according to him, saying, we are witness to a foreign policy unlike any other since Reagan, Thatcher, John Paul II defeated the Soviet Union. It's nothing like the recent failed policies we've seen in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. It seems to me to be a direct continuation of those same policies, actually. And if you read this article, this is pure fanaticism. There isn't actually a reasonable argument, a rational argument made in here. It is him just being completely fanatical. It's kind of strange to read. Gad Saad, who normally is quite reasonable on some things, disappointed me by going straight for the World War II comparison, because we can never, ever escape World War II. Every conflict is always World War II. Saddam Hussein is the new Hitler. The Ayatollah is the new Hitler. If you don't support endless wars, then you're just an anti-Semite who wants all of the Jews to die. That's his argument seemingly here. Very tiring to see this old one trotted out.
It's the same about if you want to push out immigrants, you're all kind of Nazis as well. So, you cannot ever win either side.
Yeah.
If you want to try and find a reasonable way in which our kids aren't killed and we don't see mass immigration into our country, but still find a solution to ensure that Israel is safe rather than bombing every Tom, Dick and Harry. That is not really necessarily an Israel scenario. I think it's all about the military guys who want to make money out of this. I mean, I think always follow the money. on this.
Yeah, and this was this was the most insane thing ever. This is the evangelical
Bill.
perspective, I can assume, which is: has anyone considered the possibility that America has miraculously survived so many close calls over the centuries? Is that our purpose is to defend Israel? No.
We're not quitting Israel. No chance are we ever going to do that.
No, nobody's ever considered that. I thought America was supposed to be a land for Americans to make their own destiny.
When George Washington said, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" what he actually meant is, are these the men with which we are to eventually defend a country that doesn't exist yet in 200 years down the line?
That's what Washington was meaning.
That's what Washington wanted.
That's why Jefferson signed the Declaration of Independence and wrote it. Then there are the people who've kind of turned on Trump a little bit, which is Dave Smith, who's libertarian. I actually really like Dave Smith. I know some people don't after his discussion with Douglas Murray, but I thought he came out looking much better than Murray did. He's apologized for his Trump support because the whole reason he was supporting Trump in the first place was for his promises of being anti-war, and he feels that he's turned his back on that. Tucker Carlson is probably the most notable person to turn back on him. He's released a statement here saying that Trump, if he wants to maintain support from his base, needs to allow Israel to fight their own wars. Because, of course, my perspective is, if Israel wants to go to war with Iran, they're a sovereign nation. They can start their own wars, but they can also fight their own wars, and it shouldn't be anybody else's responsibility to drag them out of it.
And they'll do very well. I think they'll be quite successful because they'll also get lots and lots of funding from the States. They'll get lots of military from there. And they've shown already that they can do it in Syria, they can do it in Lebanon. They've taken out 4 countries in less than a year. And it's just that Iran is much bigger. But actually, Iran doesn't have, I mean, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't really have that much more. I mean, remember a war with Iran-Iraq. They had one too, and there was a lot of damage. And China has not come in behind Iran, as people thought they would do, because they know if Iran goes, they're next.
Donald Trump has hit back against him. I'm going to speed through this now because this has been going on for a little while. This was a fascinating clip from a recent interview that's, I think, coming out today. Or tomorrow, from Ted Cruz on Iran, where Tucker Carlson just asks him basic questions. What's the population of Iran? What's the ethnic breakdown? Ted Cruz says he doesn't know and he doesn't need to know, and this is the exact same kind of complacent, lazy attitude that made it so difficult for America to effect effective regime change in Iraq, in Afghanistan, because you need to know the situation on the ground in a country if you're looking to change the regime there, because otherwise it will just erupt into civil war. As we saw, J.D. Vance has come out basically defending all of the decisions that have been going on recently. One of the interesting things that has been happening as well is, since the attacks have been going on, one of the goals of attacks like this is to apply pressure to the Iranian regime so that they can have a popular uprising against them, where the people on the ground blame the regime for inviting these attacks in the first place. The problem is that even in this article, and I've seen a number of other reports saying similar things, what you're finding is people who were already against the regime in Iran are saying, well, yeah, initially when we saw these oppressive generals and members of the regime being taken out, we saw hope. But now that it's becoming indiscriminate bombing attacks on Tehran, we're seeing family members die, we're fearing for our lives. What you end up doing, and this is a similar thing that happened in Germany when we were bombing Hamburg, you end up rallying the people on the ground to a nationalistic cause, because they don't see it as Israel versus the Iranian state. They're beginning to see it as Israel versus the Iranian people. And so that actually causes people to rally around their own causes and put up more resistance and strengthen the cause of the Iranian state as well, because they're the only people that they can turn to.
Comes back to the the Enoch Powell quote when he was talking to Thatcher about, I would defend this country even if it had a communist government. Because it's that same thing. It's like, well, yeah, as you say, if your people are under siege, then that comes first above ideology.
Yes, and then when we go back to the casus belli of the nuclear threat as well, you can just look at anything. This is the Christian Science Monitor, but you can find a number of other articles talking about this sort of thing, where the repeated warnings ever since 1984, really, when German engineers visited a nuclear reactor and begin to warn that there was a production of a nuclear bomb entering its final stages.
7 years away.
Yeah, 7 years away.
1986.
In 1995, there's Netanyahu warning that Iran was about to finish a nuclear weapon, etc., etc. So we know that this is just the line that they are going through to justify it. And if you're falling for this, I'm sorry, this is the same line that we've had going back to 2003 with WMDs justifying the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Netanyahu, again, for a long time has been talking about the fact that there needs to be regime change. And, oh wait, that's the same article twice. Apologies, friends. He's written a book about it in 1986 called Terrorism, How the West Can Win. I didn't know that this existed, a Netanyahu book on what needs to happen in the Middle East.
You go up there and then you'll see it.
Yes.
Syria, Iraq, Iran, they've all fallen.
Yes,
and then Yemen's in there, and Yemen won't last long, to be honest.
So that they can obtain a sort of regional hegemony, or at the very least, get rid of states that they see as hostile to themselves. And on the American side as well, you can go back 20 years and see the warnings of Pat Buchanan talking about the neoconservative establishment within the American government. He wrote a book about it, a very good book that I'd recommend, called Where the Right Went Wrong, how the neoconservative establishment, I think it's took over the Bush administration or something like that, where he was making it very, very clear, even back then, that the whole point of the American foreign policy had become to eliminate basically what were perceived as primarily Middle Eastern threats to Israel. And he'd been talking about that for a very long time. And then going to the Brian Berlitic, Berlitic, that's his name. He mentioned in an interview with the Duran yesterday that there was a 2009 Brookings Institution policy paper that basically lays out this whole play. And I was able to find it, called Which Path to Persia. And let me just read out a little bit of this here, because it's talking about different paths for an American strategy towards Iran. It talks about a number of things, including the Bush administration's funding and support for protests that had been going on even during the Bush administration, basically trying to encourage a kind of velvet revolution that they talk about. But one of the things that keeps being brought up here is regime change. And they say regime change is another strategy that could involve most of the other options in various roles. First, the United States might opt to employ some version of persuasion to set up regime change. Regime change would seem far more palatable to Americans, Middle Easterners, Europeans, and Asians, and probably even to the Iranian people, if they believe that Iran had been offered a very good deal and turned it down. Indeed, if this is the perception among Iranians, more of them might be willing to oppose the regime. Thus, starting with some effort at the persuasion would be a good way to begin, but if regime change were really Washington's goal, the United States would have to ensure that the Iranians turned down the offered deal while making sure that the deal looked attractive to others. If the Iran experts are right that Tehran is unlikely to compromise no matter what is offered as long as it feels threatened, then a clever approach to regime change might be to simultaneously offer a good deal, albeit not one so good that Tehran might overcome its paranoia, while ratcheting up a range of regime change programs that the leadership would perceive as a threat. If Iran retaliated with a major terrorist attack that killed large numbers of people, or a terrorist attack involving WMDs, especially on US soil, Washington might decide that an invasion was the only way to deal with such a dangerous Iranian regime. Indeed, for this same reason, efforts to promote regime change in Iran might be intended by the US government as deliberate provocations to try to goad the Iranians into an excessive response that might then justify an American invasion. Now, that's very interesting that all of that is just available in a policy paper from 2009 that you can find online, which suggests to me especially when coupled with the fact that you can go back to 2007 and see Wesley Clark talking about how immediately after the 9/11 attacks, there was discussions on how to take out 7 countries in 5 years. Obviously, the time scale extended, but the countries remain the same. That was Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and then finishing off with Iran. It seems to me that Donald Trump's promise to drain the swamp, eliminate the deep state, hasn't worked, if that was ever a promise he was going to keep in the first place, because the foreign policy that I see being pursued today seems like an unbroken continuation of the policy that has been going on since at least the Bush administration. So again, let me know what you think about this. Let me know, do you think that this is going to lose support for Trump, or do you think that people are going to be able to excuse it, or are you in favor of war? That'd be very interesting. I mean, if you are, I'd like to know if you believe the nukes lie, or if it's just that you genuinely believe that there should be regime change. If you admit the second, I admire and respect your honesty. Sorry that went on for so long, chat.
No,
there was just a lot.
If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.